Jeannette Tamayo was only 9 years old when she vanished. But it wasn't fear that kept her alive. It was strategy. And the man who took her, Silas Vorn, had no idea that his young captive was quietly turning into his greatest threat. This is the chilling true crime story of a child who used everything she learned from her favorite TV crime shows to manipulate her kidnapper, outsmart his twisted plan, and leave behind a trail of clues that would ultimately lead rescuers right to her. On a warm and ordinary summer afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Meadowridge Lane, everything seemed calm. Children were riding bikes, neighbors were tending their gardens, and parents were beginning their evening routines. Among the families living there was the Tamayo household. Hard-working, close-knit, and well-liked. 9-year-old Jeannette Tamayo had just returned from school, her pink backpack slung over one shoulder, and her hair tied neatly in braids. She was a smart, curious child, with a deep interest in mysteries. While most kids her age were busy watching cartoons, Jeannette preferred crime shows. She loved the puzzles, the way investigators followed clues, and how justice was always served in the end. No one could have imagined that, within just an hour of walking home that day, Jeannette would disappear. Her disappearance was discovered almost immediately. Her mother had stepped outside to call her in for dinner and noticed that Jeannette hadn't come inside. She called her name several times, expecting to see her pop out from a neighbor's porch or from behind a tree, but there was no sign of her. At first, it seemed like she might have wandered off to play or had gone to a friend's house without asking. But when her pink backpack was found at the edge of a sidewalk near a small wooded path, unzipped with her notebook scattered, it was clear something was wrong. Panic spread quickly. Neighbors formed search parties. Police were contacted immediately. Officers sealed off the area and brought in dogs to pick up a scent. Helicopters circled above as volunteers combed through the nearby woods and creeks. But there were no footprints, no tire marks, no broken branches. Nothing. It was as if Jeannette had vanished into thin air. The only clue was a faint smear of dirt on the backpack strap, as though someone had grabbed it in a hurry. Investigators weren't even sure if she had been taken by force, wandered off, or had gone willingly with someone she trusted. The media arrived within hours. News vans parked along the streets, and reporters delivered live updates. Jeannette's school released a statement, and her teachers, visibly emotional, described her as bright, polite, and unusually insightful for her age. Her parents made a public plea, begging whoever had taken her to bring her home safely. A photo of Jeannette, smiling with her chin resting on her hands, was plastered across news outlets and social media feeds. But the hours kept passing, and Jeannette didn't return. As the investigation grew deeper, detectives learned more about her interests. One detective in particular, Officer Lyle Desner, was struck by something unusual. When reviewing footage from the family's home security camera, he noticed that Jeannette often played in the yard reenacting scenes from crime shows. She would lay out evidence, pretend to draw chalk outlines, and even write things down in what she called her clue book. She took her pretend investigations seriously. This led investigators to believe that if she had been taken, Jeannette might have tried to observe her surroundings or leave clues. It was a small hope in a grim situation. Despite the efforts, days passed with no signs of her. Police began to widen their scope, checking every known offender within a 20-mile radius. They visited homes, checked basements, garages, and remote cabins. Nothing turned up. But what no one knew was that Jeannette was still alive, and she was using everything she had ever learned from her favorite TV shows. While the outside world searched desperately, she was quietly preparing her own plan, taking mental notes, remembering routines, and looking for any chance to escape. She was scared, but not helpless. What had started as a terrifying ordeal would soon turn into a battle of wits between a quiet child and a man who had underestimated her completely. Jeannette Tamayo slowly opened her eyes to complete darkness. The air around her was damp, and the floor beneath her felt like unfinished cement. Her hands were not tied, but the heavy metal door above the basement stairs was firmly shut. She wasn't sure how long she had been unconscious, but her head ached, and her legs were sore. The last thing she remembered was walking past the wooded path on her way home. Then, a rush of movement, a hand over her mouth, and the sudden snap into silence. Now, she was in an unfamiliar place, underground, alone. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to notice details. There was a small cot in the corner, with a tattered blanket. A flickering light bulb hung from a long wire in the ceiling, barely lighting the space. A bucket sat in the corner. One high, narrow window was covered in dust and grime, and on the far side, mounted on the ceiling, was a small security camera pointing directly at her. She looked away, pretending she didn't notice it. She knew what it was. She had seen setups like this on the show she watched, always in episodes involving kidnappers who like to monitor their victims. A few hours passed before the man finally came downstairs. He was tall, heavy-set, and moved with a limp. His face was partially covered by a hood, but she could see he wore a green wristwatch. Bright, shiny, and out of place compared to the rest of his grim appearance. He didn't speak much. He left a tray with food and water, glanced at the camera, and walked back up. The door locked with a loud metal click. That green wristwatch stayed on his wrist every time he came down. It ticked loudly when he leaned over, a sound echoing against the basement walls. Jeannette noticed it right away. Every detail mattered. She began memorizing things. Not just the watch, but the times he appeared, the kind of food he brought, how many steps creaked when he walked down. She observed the noises from above. A fridge door, a microwave, the sound of running water. She even timed his bathroom breaks by how long he left her alone. She was collecting information, the way detectives on TV did before making their move. What terrified her more than anything was how ordinary the man behaved. He didn't scream, didn't act like a monster, but something about the coldness in his silence made him even more disturbing. He never said her name. He didn't try to talk to her, but he watched through that camera, or sometimes from the top of the stairs with the door cracked, just enough to hear her. It was control he wanted. And Jeannette knew if she let him think he was in full control, he might get comfortable and make mistakes. One night she heard a phone ring from upstairs. It was faint, but she could tell it was a landline. The man answered and had a short conversation, muffled by distance. But she caught a name, Silas. That was the first real piece of information she had. Silas. She repeated in her head again and again, so she wouldn't forget. Later, she would learn that his full name was Silas Vorn, a reclusive man who lived just outside the town's industrial zone. He had inherited his house from an uncle and barely interacted with the community. His name had come up once before in the investigation, but with no criminal record tied to children, he hadn't been a priority. Jeannette started testing her limits. She would move things slightly before he came in. Her shoes, a plate, the pillow, just to see if he noticed. If he did, he didn't say, but she watched his face carefully for any reaction. Once, she coughed violently to draw his attention. He brought her cough syrup the next day. That told her he had medicine. That told her where it was kept. Probably a cabinet above ground. While Silas believed he had captured a helpless girl, Jeannette was slowly building her plan. She wasn't trying to fight him. She was studying him, watching, learning, and waiting. Every hour that passed, she turned his assumption of power into his greatest weakness. What Silas didn't know was that the real threat wasn't the police knocking on his door. It was the quiet little girl in his basement. Time moved slowly in the basement. Each day blended into the next, marked only by the sound of footsteps above, or the tray of food slid across the floor. Jeannette Tamayo had no clock, no calendar, but she used the rhythm of Silas Vorn's movements to track time. She began dividing her day by his actions. The first appearance, the second tray, the night when the light above flickered 3 times before going out. Her body adapted to the silence, but her mind remained sharp. She spent hours lying still, thinking, planning, and analyzing everything she had learned. Silas followed a routine. Every morning, he came downstairs wearing the same gray hoodie. He always brought a plate of food, crackers, canned vegetables, or microwaved leftovers, and a bottle of water. At midday, he opened the small basement window just a crack for air, only for a few minutes. In the evening, he returned with a second plate and sometimes muttered to himself before locking the door. He rarely spoke to her. He didn't threaten or touch her, but he watched her constantly. Jeannette pretended not to notice, but she had identified the 3 spots in the room where the camera couldn't reach. Those became her safe zones for thinking clearly. She realized quickly that Silas believed she was too scared to try anything. He thought of her as weak, too young to cause trouble. She decided to use that to her advantage. She began acting softer, more obedient. She cleaned up her tray without being asked. She sat quietly and showed signs of boredom. She even pretended to cry softly some nights, knowing he was likely watching. Slowly, she built a false image of herself for him to believe. One evening, she asked for a book. He didn't respond, but the next day, he brought her an old crossword puzzle book with half the pages already filled in. That was the first time he did something she requested. It told her 2 things. First, that he might begin to trust her, and second, that he still had access to his regular possessions, meaning he hadn't completely isolated himself. There were more items upstairs, maybe even a computer, possibly even access to the internet. That made her hopeful. If he was still connected to the outside world, then he might slip up. Jeannette also began studying the basement itself. The walls were old concrete, and the floor had several small cracks. A narrow vent near the ceiling connected to the upstairs hallway. She couldn't reach it, but she knew air traveled through it. She started thinking about leaving signals, things only someone who knew where to look would notice. In the corner behind the cot, she carved tiny letters with a metal fork. Time she had bent out of shape. Her initials, a date, and a word. Alive. She created a pattern of clues. She began leaving small objects in unlikely places. A hair tie inside the air vent grate. a bracelet bead under the edge of the cot, a strip from the corner of her shirt stuffed into the gap between the wall and the water heater. These were not random. They were placed where a search team might eventually check. Each object was something personal, something that would confirm she had been there. Then she turned her attention to Silas's behavior. She started asking him seemingly harmless questions. What time was it? What day was it? Where did he get the food? He often ignored her, but once or twice he answered in vague terms. She smiled politely, never pushing too hard. She made herself appear small and safe. She praised the food even when it was bad. One day, she even told him she was happy he didn't hurt her like people on TV did. That made him pause. She filed that moment away. It meant he cared about the image he projected. Jeannette knew that real escape was still out of reach. The door was locked tight, and she had no idea what lay beyond the stairs. But her strategy wasn't just about running. It was about building trust, luring Silas into comfort, and collecting every detail she could. The man thought he had captured a child, but what he had really done was trap himself in a room with someone far more observant than he realized. Every moment Jeannette spent in that basement, she was tightening the invisible trap she had begun to weave around him. The first real opportunity came late one night, when Silas returned to the basement in a rush. He was sweating. His movements were jerky, and his hands trembled as he placed the dinner tray down. Jeannette could tell something had changed. He didn't make eye contact, didn't linger near the stairs like usual. Instead, he backed away quickly, locking the door without a word. For the first time since her abduction, he seemed genuinely nervous. That gave her hope. Something had happened outside, something that rattled him. The next morning confirmed her suspicion. Silas didn't appear at his usual time. Hours passed without food, without footsteps. The basement stayed silent, except for the hum of the distant water heater and the occasional car passing outside. Jeannette remained still, waiting. When he finally arrived, it was almost dark. His clothes were dirty, and he carried nothing with him. No food, no water. He looked directly at her for the first time in days. His expression was hard to read, part frustration, part fear. Then, without speaking, he turned and left. Jeannette knew the pressure on him must have increased. Perhaps the police were closing in. Maybe a neighbor had grown suspicious, or someone had seen something. It didn't matter what had caused it. What mattered was that Silas was no longer in control. He was making mistakes. She could feel the change in the air. That night, she moved into action. She began tapping rhythms against the vent at odd intervals, creating noise patterns that someone upstairs might notice. She dragged the metal food tray slowly across the cement floor, leaving scratch marks that formed the word "Help" in block letters. She pulled more threads from her shirt and stuffed them into the corners of the cot and the base of the stairs, each one holding a strand of her hair. Evidence. The following morning, she did something riskier. She left a fake note on the food tray. Written in pencil from the puzzle book, the note read, "Thank you for keeping me safe." It was short, almost innocent, but it was a test. She needed to know how Silas would react. When he came in that afternoon and saw it, he paused. His face twitched slightly. Then he crumpled the paper and stuffed it into his pocket. He didn't speak, but that twitch gave her something valuable. He didn't like being seen as a caregiver. That meant he wanted to believe he was in control. not being kind. This psychological pressure was part of her strategy. If she could make him feel observed, analyzed, uncomfortable, he might become careless. And careless captors made critical errors. Jeannette remembered something from one of her favorite true crime episodes. The suspect always cracks when they stop feeling invisible. She decided it was time to be seen. The next time Silas brought her food, she sat upright and looked directly at the camera for a full minute after he left. Then she mouthed the word "police" slowly and repeatedly. She knew if anyone ever reviewed the footage, those few seconds might matter. She even pointed to the high window, trying to create a visual code. She was no longer hiding in shadows. She was starting to leave a trail. That same week, heavy rainstorms rolled in. Water leaked through the window and began pooling in the basement's corner. Silas didn't come down for 2 full days. Jeannette rationed the remaining food and used a piece of her blanket to soak up water and wring it into the empty bottle. She began coughing badly. Whether from the cold or the stress, she couldn't tell. But even through the shivering and weakness, she remained focused. Finally, on the 3rd morning, he returned. But this time, something was different. He looked panicked, his hair disheveled, his breathing short. He stood in the doorway and shouted something to himself. A name, maybe, before slamming the door shut without entering. Jeannette's heart raced. This wasn't routine panic. This was fear of exposure. She had no way of knowing that her clues were starting to work. A local dog walker had reported hearing odd tapping from a storm drain near the Vorn property. A missing poster with Jeannette's face had been pinned at a local gas station, just 2 blocks from where Silas had bought supplies. The police were finally circling in. But inside the basement, Jeannette knew only one thing for sure. Her time was running out. And so was his. The air in the basement had changed. Jeannette could feel it in her chest. An electric tension, a stillness just before something broke. The walls no longer felt like barriers, but like surfaces pressing inward, warning her that the end was near, one way or another. Silas Vorn had stopped coming regularly. For nearly 2 days, no food arrived, no water, no footsteps, only silence. She didn't know if he had fled or if something worse was about to happen. Her body was weak, her lips dry and cracked, but her mind stayed alert. Every detail still mattered. She listened carefully for sounds from above, straining to catch anything. A voice, a door creaking, even footsteps on gravel. What she heard instead was a low thumping, rhythmic and unnatural. At first, she thought it might be thunder, but then it grew louder. It wasn't thunder. It was boots, several of them, moving quickly. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the house, then shouting. Not Silas. This was organized, fast, commanding. Someone kicked open a door. Dogs barked. The pounding of boots filled the space above her. Jeannette crawled to the far side of the basement and pressed her ear against the cold wall. Voices were shouting instructions. Then the unmistakable sound of a metal crowbar prying something open. The basement door. The first person she saw wasn't Silas. It was a woman in uniform, her face serious but kind. The flashlight beam cut through the dimness and landed on Jeannette's pale, shaking form. The woman didn't scream or rush. She moved slowly, speaking in calm, careful words that Jeannette couldn't hear over the roar in her ears. Behind her, 2 more officers entered, one kneeling to assess Jeannette, the other scanning the room for signs, evidence, traps, anything. Outside, Flashing red and blue lights lit up the overgrown driveway. Paramedics wrapped Jeannette in a blanket and checked her vitals. She blinked at the sky for the first time in what felt like forever. The sun was setting, but to her, it felt like the brightest light in the world. She could barely speak, but when someone asked her name, she whispered it. "Jeannette Tamayo." The officer wrote it down, even though they already knew. Silas Vorn had been found hiding in the attic, curled into a corner with a backpack filled with cash and burner phones. He had planned to flee that night, likely to an abandoned property several counties away. His car was already packed, but his face had appeared on a gas station security camera days earlier, caught in the background when someone used the ATM. The investigators were stunned by what they found in the basement. Coded messages scratched into walls, hair samples and vent covers. Even a water-stained crossword page with numbers circled in patterns. They realized Jeannette had been laying out a psychological trail, a silent cry for help disguised as subtle clues. She had turned her prison into a puzzle that pointed toward the truth. The media exploded with the story. Headlines called her the girl who solved her own case, a real-life detective, and the child genius who beat her kidnapper. But behind the headlines was a child who had endured the unthinkable with patience, intelligence, and quiet courage. She didn't want to be a hero. She just wanted to go home. Jeannette's recovery was long. She spent weeks in the hospital, regaining strength, learning to sleep in a bed without concrete walls around her, and adjusting to a life where her name was known by strangers. But she also received letters, hundreds of them, from people around the world who said she had inspired them. Silas Vorn was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In court, he remained silent, never offering an apology. Jeannette didn't attend the sentencing. She had already moved on in her mind, refusing to let him live rent-free in her thoughts. She had learned something important. Monsters lose their power when you stop fearing them. Years later, she would go on to study criminal psychology. But even at 9 years old, Jeannette Tamayo had already done what many adults could not. She had taken control of her story, and in doing so, she didn't just survive. She won.